This is not another video that tells you Make in India has failed or that it's succeeding. Now that debate is for you to have based on the facts that you want to weigh. The real story of manufacturing lies outside press conference or investment summits. I'll take you to the reality on the factory floor, what's happening in the supply chain and in the decisions made 40 years ago in a country that looks nothing like India, but somehow became the benchmark for everything India is trying to do now. Hello folks, I'm Shashank. You're tuned into Finshots TV.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be part of the celebrations of the Make in India Week.
The Make in India.
It's Make in India.
Make in India.
Make in India campaign.
For the sustained development of any economy, a core sector such as manufacturing has a huge role to play.
Come, Make in India.
This video is part of our Make in India Better series, a series dedicated to finding what's holding India back and asking what it would actually take to fix it. Okay, so let's start where everyone should start with when they talk about Make in India, with China. Okay, let's go back to China in 1978. It was a poor, rural, largely agrarian country. Manufacturing was negligible, exports were almost zero, and then Deng Xiaoping, I'm hoping I pronounced that right, he opened China carefully and deliberately to foreign capital and market forces. What followed over the next 4 decades was a grind, a specific deliberate discipline grind. China scaled up technical and vocational education through the 1990s and 2000s, focusing on hands-on skills, machining, electronics, assembly. State firms retrained redundant agricultural labor, migration policies let rural workers move to cities, local governments competed to attract factories by offering housing, training and subsidies. Young men and women from villages across the country traveled long distances to live near factories because factory work had dignity at that time and factory wages were quite good. And every year of exports taught manufacturers something. Every rejected shipment cost a factory a contract. So factories learned to obsess over precision, okay? Every international buyer who came to Shenzhen left with higher standards than they brought. By 2024, Foxconn's dark factories in Shenzhen were reporting first pass yields about 99.7%. Chinese factories were operating with 470 industrial robots per 10,000 workers, and that's more than Germany, which had long been the global benchmark. Folks, now that's a country that spent 40 years being very, very good at something that is genuinely hard. And it's the context that you need to understand what India is actually attempting and where the gaps are. Now, the first gap is right on the factory floor. In 2023, Apple was assembling iPhones in India through its top 3 manufacturing partners. It was one of the most high-profile moments in Make in India history, a genuine global vote of confidence. People trusted India. And then the numbers came in. Apple was reportedly rejecting 50% of iPhone casings produced in India for not meeting quality standards. The quality problems during iPhone 15 assembly were so bad that Apple cut prices to reduce the impact. Tim Cook personally visited China to adjust the supply chain, and part of the production moved back to the mainland China. Now that story didn't travel very far in Indian media, but I feel that it should have. On Hacker News, where global manufacturers and engineers actually talk openly, a thread on this produced one of the most honest accounts that I've seen from someone who had worked with Indian factories directly. And they wrote, in India, most manufacturing companies are trying to sell what they have or can produce without any attention to detail. False promises and contracts are prevalent. There are no SOPs in place or any organized sampling process in most Indian companies versus Chinese who keep everything very formal and organized. I never visited China and manufacturing went perfect. In India, I personally visited the factories and still could not get the job done. All samples were rejected. I know this is one person's experience, but it's consistent with what Apple number shows. Wistron, one of Apple's top 3 manufacturing partners globally, eventually sold its Indian facility to Tata and exited the country entirely. It was unable to generate any profits from its Apple business in India. Management issues, there were worker retention problems, and differences in work culture. Now, they were all cited. The facility it sold in Kolar, near Bangalore, is the same one where workers had rioted in December 2020 over unpaid wages. Wistron came, they spent years trying to make it work, they couldn't turn a profit and quietly left. Now that's the exit story. Now, I'm not telling you that Indian workers are bad workers. They're not. This story that I narrated is about a quality culture that China spent 40 years building and India hasn't built yet. China's precision culture was forced through consequences. With every rejected shipment, with every lost contract, with every buyer who went elsewhere. Now, that taught a factory something. That feedback loop, sustained over decades, is what makes Chinese manufacturing the benchmark. India's manufacturing base grew up largely serving a protected domestic market where relationships and price mattered more than precision. That is a structural reality, and the question is whether Indian policy is designed to change it or just to attract investment into a system that still has this gap at its core. The second gap involves a country that most Indians don't even think of as a competitor. I'm talking about Bangladesh. India has the second largest textile manufacturing capacity in the world. It roughly employs 4.5 crore people in textiles, and somehow Bangladesh surpassed India in apparel exports in 2003. Vietnam surpassed India in 2011. In one recent year, Bangladesh's exports to US grew 12%. Vietnam's grew 14%, India's grew only 8%. The average Indian garment factory has about 150 people and about 80 machines. The average Bangladeshi factory has 600 people. Now, scale matters enormously in garment manufacturing. It's the difference between being able to take a large international order and not. But the scale gap isn't the only problem. India's export basket remains too cotton heavy even as global demand has shifted towards man-made fibers, athleisure, winter wear, and blended categories. India kept making what it was good at while the market moved somewhere else. Bangladesh, as a least developed country, also enjoys a duty-free access to major markets in the world. That's a trade advantage that India cannot replicate but also hasn't found a way to offset through FTAs. The result is a sector where India ranks second in manufacturing capacity but sixth in global exports. Second in factories, sixth in results. Now that gap has a name, and it's called execution. The bitter irony right now is that Bangladesh is facing genuine political instability. Manufacturing orders that had been flowing to Dhaka are now looking for a new home. This should be India's moment. Whether the system can move fast enough to capture it is a real test, and history suggests the answer requires more urgency than the system currently has. The third gap is external, and it's the most unsettling one. In early 2025, a detailed breakdown went viral laying out how China is quietly making it harder for India to move up the manufacturing value chain. China is playing what analysts call a silent industrial chess. Vietnam's electronics exports stand at about $126 billion. India's stand at $26 billion. Only 1 in 10 Japanese companies that explore manufacturing in India actually invest, citing regulatory complexity, red tape, and lack of execution certainty. The specific mechanism worth understanding here is Chinese authorities reportedly began discouraging the transfer of advanced technology and equipment to overseas markets, including India. Foxconn quietly recalled over 300 Chinese engineers and technicians from its India plants. These are the people who train workers, maintain high-precision assembly lines, and carry the tacit knowledge that makes quality manufacturing possible. When they left, efficiency dropped. The timing aligned with informal policy signals from Beijing. Foxconn and Apple haven't officially confirmed the reason for the recall, but the effect is documented. India currently produces about 15% of Apple's global iPhone output against a target of 25%. That gap between target and reality is partly this. The knowledge transfer that was supposed to happen is being slowed at the source. China isn't fighting India with tariffs, it's shaping the narrative that India is the option that sounds good in a summit but proves difficult in execution. Now, whether that's deliberate strategy or the compounding result of 40 years of advantage is debatable. The outcome isn't. So, what actually moves the needle? Land acquisition reform is unavoidable. Acquiring land for a factory in India is slow, expensive, and legally uncertain. Titles are unclear, authorities are fragmented, stamp duties vary widely across states. The Confederation of Indian Industry has proposed a land council modeled on the GST Council, center-state coordination, integrated single-window authorities in each state, conclusive titling. This has been stalled for years because it is politically hard. It will remain politically hard for a long time. The economic cost of not doing it is now higher than the political cost of doing it. The 4 labor code parts passed in 2020 need full implementation across states. The share of contract workers in India's formal manufacturing workforce has grown from 23% in 2002 to over 40%. A workforce that is predominantly contractual doesn't build deep manufacturing capability. It moves when the contract ends and takes the knowledge with it. Stability of workforce is what built China's factory culture. India's labor market currently works against that stability, and quality culture cannot be mandated, but it can be incentivized. The PLI scheme pays on production volumes. It could start paying differently, rewarding export quality certifications, zero defect benchmarks, international buyer retention rates. The incentive shapes the behavior. Right now, the incentive is to produce. It could be redesigned to incentivize producing well. Folks, Make in India is not a failure. Pharma has genuinely worked because India went from 1,930 crore rupees import deficit in bulk drugs to a 2,280 crore rupees surplus in just 3 years. Electronics assembly has scaled, the investment is real, but the gap between assembling things and making things happen, and making things between attracting factories and building the culture that makes those factories excellent, now that gap is real, documented, and not closing fast enough, given the window that current geopolitics has opened. China took 40 years, India doesn't have 40 years, which means the pace of reform, the honesty about what's actually happening on factory floors, and the willingness to learn from a 50% rejection rate rather than bury it, now that matters more right now than it ever has. The facts are on the table. What you make of them is up to you. Anyways, folks, that's it for today. If you work in manufacturing or have worked with Indian factories, I genuinely want to hear what it's like on the ground. Drop it in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.